Congratulations, winners. How very exciting and how very international. We have had so many participants from all over the world. And talking about international, I just wanted to also give a quick shout out to some of the very many WITS regional events that have been happening prior to today as well. For example, last week, the WITS Kingdom of Saudi Arabia held a series of events that featured over 100 speakers for a whole week, broadcasting from 13 locations. Thank you very much to all the WITS KSA ambassadors. And now I'm really looking forward to the next part of our session here. It's a panel discussion about globalization and democratization. When data science first really started penetrating all areas of research and industry and decision making, I was really hopeful. You know, data became the new oil, the new gold, the new bacon, however you want to call it. And I had high hopes. We were no longer geographically constrained with data. We didn't have to be on top of a gold mine or on top of a reservoir for oil. And anybody could partake in this new development and in sharing in the wealth. Now, what has happened is perhaps a little different. There are huge concentrations of power and money at a few companies. Big powerhouses created in the United States and also in China. And I want to spend some time with three wonderful guests here today talking about these kinds of issues. So central questions in this panel are what happened and why, but more, how can we move forward? What would it take to truly democratize and to globalize data science? And what are the perils if we don't? So joining us today are, in alphabetical order, Amanda Obidike, who's calling in from Nigeria. She's the Executive Director of STEMi Makers Africa, and she oversees the design and implementation of STEM educations across 19 sub-Saharan countries. She's preparing the next generation of Africans with STEM skills for Africa's workforce. She was named top 5 female innovators in Africa, 30 under 30 inspiring leaders of Africa, and many other awards for championing diversity in technology. We're also joined by Mary Gray, here from the US, joining us from the East Coast. She's the Senior Principal Researcher at Microsoft Research, and she chairs the Microsoft Research Ethics Review Program, the only federally registered institutional review board of its kind in technology. She's also a faculty associate at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and she holds a faculty position in the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing and Engineering at Indiana University. She's an anthropologist and media scholar by training. In 2020, Mary was named a MacArthur Fellow for her work. And then we're joined from Australia. This is a very international panel by Zhamak Dehghani. She's the Director of Emerging Technologies in North America at Thoughtworks. She has worked as a technologist for over 20 years and has a deep passion for decentralized technology solutions, the foundations for the democratization, and a focus on distributed systems and big data architecture. She is the developer of Data Mesh, and she is also going to talk about this in one of the workshops later on. So welcome to this panel. I'm very excited to talk with you and learn from you. And I would like to start with Mary. Mary, the growth and importance of data-driven industries, particularly in tech, has seen an incredible boom in areas like Silicon Valley, with large companies owning a large piece of the pie. Now, some of these companies do talk about their contributions to democratization. When I talk about this with people in Silicon Valley, sometimes I get the so what? We're doing good for the world. We are sharing. So my question to you is, as somebody who's been in the Valley and knows that culture very well, so what?
Well, thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm really excited to share the stage with my colleagues here. At the very early days, as you noted, of the boom of the internet, I think so few of us thought through what would happen to the data that we generate when we're just living our everyday lives online. And fast forward to now, the accumulation of data is largely happening in these proprietary systems. And there wasn't a moment along the way, which were early days, but there wasn't a moment along the way where we collectively said, hey, we should really be sharing in the wealth. And most importantly, the democratic possibilities of data begin with people being able to have control and have full say over what happens to the kind of information they create. Because the toughest thing is that for most computer science and engineering, they've been looking at data. And if you just spend a little bit of time thinking about the broader world in which the internet has become so fundamental, you see most of us are just talking with each other, learning from each other. And that's a fundamentally social act and hopefully could be a public good. So the so what is precisely the need to see that just because you've created fancy tech or not so fancy tech that people are drawn to generate value in their own lives, that doesn't mean you get to control what happens to the data that comes out of those exchanges. That's fundamental to society, to have a right and a place for people to set the rules and the guardrails for the use of data.
And what do you think, Mary, needs to happen to get there, to a place where the data is owned by the people who create it?
I mean, one of the most important first steps is, I think my colleagues on this panel will speak to. It's really empowering people to see that they not only have a right, but they have the capacity to learn how to control their data. So I would say the number one step, it's breaking down the myths that surround the stories that are told about the complexities of data science, and to be able to see it as something that we can learn, we can teach each other, that we have the opportunity to basically begin the public conversation around the public good that that data can be, if we treat it as a public good rather than something that should generate wealth for a few who can control it.
And so let me ask you, Mary, if you were the president of the United States, what would you do in the States to get this started? Would you regulate? Would you interrogate? What would you do?
There really isn't a way forward without regulating. The reality of the creation of data that's happening mostly through, again, these social environments is that we need to broker a relationship between public interest and the public's need to be able to be a full partner in managing data, and technology companies that absolutely have brought value, generate a lot of possibility, but literally we've not even started regulating this industry. I like to compare it to where we were with biomedicine. We wouldn't have the vaccines that we had to cure polio, for example, if we didn't have an industry budding at the time that believed that whatever it created, it was for the public good. So it's looking at this industry that I think mostly through the confluence of timing and a lack of watching the ball when it comes to building technologies, that we've not had a moment in the United States to say people and the general public have a right to deliberate around how their data should be used and under what conditions. And that's really the starting point. We absolutely need regulation, but I think it's also about every individual citizen recognizing their fundamental right to control information about themselves and their social relationships.
Thank you very much, Mary. Amanda, I'm really interested in your perspective. So at the moment, the powerhouses of data science in terms of these very large companies are the US and China. But data science and broader STEM do offer tremendous opportunities elsewhere too, and certainly also in Africa. There are barriers, however, to that, and your work has been very inspiring. If we all want to have access to the opportunities that data science offers, what is needed and what are you doing in Africa to establish that?
Okay, thank you. So, just like Mary said, I think we need to know our rights in having access to this data and how to use it. Over time, because of the work we do, we need data, reliable data. And unfortunately, it's not in our control. It's either with the government or either with the ministry. And accessing this data, it could be very, very difficult. And you're asking yourself how there is need to democratize data without losing control, because we understand that why the government does this is fear, and because there is a concern of sensitive data falling into the wrong hands. But we found out that it's about dialogue and having these conversations with the government, or having these conversations with these people who have data. It would be, I don't know, the US call it like the big, we call it maybe the powers that be here. So it's just about collaborating with them, making them see that this data is to help their government, their policies. So whatever they are designing, whether it's something centered on gender inclusion or better education, we are collaborating together and we're showing them the outcome.
Yeah, and apart from data, of course, you also need people who are trained to use it and can and develop the algorithms. And I so much admire the work that you're doing in Africa to help with education of students all around the sub-Saharan area. Um, what were what were the biggest challenges for you there to set this up?
Wow. Okay. So, first things first, it was really because data now is the new oil. We need data in whether we want to design a project or implement something. We just need something reliable. And we found out that there are no tools to analyze these data because, this data is not with us, number one, and is so unformed. So, we started gathering these data to ensure that we have whatever project that we're designing should be sustainable. So it's one thing to equip teachers, by giving them technology in their classrooms. Is another thing to ensure that these tools are being used. So we started gathering this data ourselves, no matter how small. It took us months. I think it took us a year, 3 months to ensure that we have this data our own, because key stakeholders, were not just forthcoming about it. But we have over time put in technology methods in place to ensure data that we have is simple and is something that we can also extend to local communities.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Zhamak, I'd like to go over to you. Data science is a complex sport and enterprise, as you sometimes say. I'm mostly an algorithm developer, and I don't tend to think too much about technological barriers to realize dreams. Um, but you do. You think about how data can really truly be shared and democratized, but from a hardware perspective and a management perspective. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about the work that you've done and what barriers you see that are on the technological side to sharing and democratizing, and how you have worked on removing those.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here and sharing that. It was interesting. We came into the room as the previous talk was wrapping up, and I recall the talk before last finished on this sentence that data is not available at scale. And this was, it was prohibiting building machine learning models and intelligently augmenting, capabilities. And why is that? why, despite generating so much data as a byproduct of just us talking here to each other, or using our applications or interacting with various service providers, why data is not available at scale? My hypothesis is that we've got this wrong, and we've got to challenge almost a half a century paradigm that data needs to be centralized. Data need to be collected and centralized so that we can use it. And if you centralize a solution, you then centralize power, you centralize teams, and that solution doesn't scale. It will fall down on its own, under its own weight of monolithic systems and monolithic structures and monolithic infrastructures. So my hypothesis is that instead of collecting data, we need to connect data. So what does it take? What is the infrastructure and capabilities that we need to build so that we can truly have distributed ownership, as Mary was talking about initially from kind of policy perspective, that control of the data and make data shareable and accessible at the point of origin. If I'm generating data and if I'm, it's just a business unit in an enterprise, or is a, individual, doesn't matter. You can kind of scale that paradigm up and down. That entity should be able to be incentivized in the first place to share data and then be enabled and empowered with the infrastructure and technology that allows connecting the data. So I use the parallel of availability of compute at scale. It really happened from early days of computing by thinking about applications as this small applications that do one thing really well, but they interoperate really well. So that interoperability that came from the Unix philosophy, right? Unix philosophy is the foundation of how we build cloud computing, how we build, APIs for interoperability. That Unix philosophy is lost when it came to data. I don't know what leap we made, but we escaped that, and we said data needs to be centralized. So in my mind, we need to go back to the blackboard or the whiteboard these days, or virtual whiteboards perhaps, and really think about what it takes to create that distributed ownership of the data, what sort of protocols and standards we need to place for interoperability of now these disparate data sets that could be anywhere, and then think about what is the trust infrastructure, like the security and trust infrastructure that we need to be put in place so that I can comfortably, as an organization or as a business unit within an organization, share that data with a high level of trust that the privacy is being respected. So there is a lot to do at all levels of stack for that distributed ownership and distributed sharing of interoperable data.
Well, thank you, Zhamak. When we were preparing for this panel and talking amongst ourselves, you mentioned that often within companies it is difficult to share data across the various branches, and I can just imagine that sharing internationally comes up with all sorts of other huge barriers and challenges. And I'm thinking particularly about the situation we're in right now in the pandemic with COVID. There's a lot of data analysis done on the pandemic, but of course this is an international issue. And so data sharing across countries is incredibly important for this. How can this be done at an international stage across countries? Within companies it's already hard, but how would we do this internationally?
Yeah, I think once we've gone beyond that paradigm or belief system that we need to be centralizing data to get value, and believe that, okay, let's get value out of decentralized data, that it could be either within organizations or internationally, then we can think about what are those components that we need to put in place. I think we have prior art that we can go back and learn from. The prior art to me is how we enabled democratization of programming and applications really through some really basic components. I mean, it's really hard to build those basic components, but there are really some few basic ingredients. One is the availability of infrastructure that cloud provided, right? So bringing the barrier to entry for storing and sharing and building, transformations and machine learning on top of the data through cloud services. So that trend will, in terms of infrastructure, will continue. And I think the missing piece is, how do we now connect the data? What are the protocols we need to have? The prior art in the computational world that led to the API revolution was that we agreed upon a set of protocols, like protocols that internet were built on, right? HTTP and then REST or follow-on protocols around it, to be able to build these APIs that interconnect them. So then what does that mean to build a set of standards and protocols that allow sharing big data, and particularly analytical data? Analytical data has certain attributes that is slightly different from like sharing APIs to, I don't know, run a monetary transaction. Analytical data usually has large volumes. It's time variant. You capture it over a period of time with different resolutions. So there is a set of protocols, I think, that standardize that. We need to start building to allow data be spoken with the same language, even though that it might result in different pods, in different infrastructure, and then a set of tooling that allows perform operations across this now interoperable data that is scattered. So I'm able to actually emerge intelligence from this distributed data by running queries across the world. So we really need to start, I think, with a set of protocols that standardizes interoperability and language around data sharing, and then the tooling that extends that and allows combining and collecting data and joining and creating intelligence on top of it.
Well, thanks for that, Zhamak, and thanks also for contributing to this incredible challenge. Mary, I'd like to go back to you, because I'm wondering what you think the role of large companies should be in this globalization. So we hear a lot of companies, including Microsoft, the company that you work for, talk about their contributions to democratization and globalization and sharing data. What is their role right now? What should it be? And how can we convince the companies to do more?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so inspired thinking about the possibilities of something like data trusts that are effectively the kind of distributed, accessible exchanges where people who have really valuable data to share, that's often very difficult to get from a web scrape or from whatever might be posted online, that give people an opportunity to contribute to particular problems that they want to see solved. So that's a place where companies could be playing a role. They could be facilitating, giving people conduits for being able to connect their data with trusts that give them very clear terms that say what are the agreements under which you're entering and when will your data be repurposed. Because for all the metaphors we have about thinking of data as a kind of element, oil or water, in many ways it's us. We're basically leaving traces of our place in the world. And so to create the infrastructure that lets us say, I want to put myself in another place and be able to connect with someone else and be able to bridge our data, that is something that, again, technology companies could be facilitating. And the problem to date is they've effectively been allowed to hoard whatever data we create as we're moving around our lives and generating these traces of ourselves. So I feel like there's a lot of possibility, but it really can't be an ask of companies. It has to be a demand. It's our right as humans, as citizens, to be able to have our data represent us, but also be able to facilitate what we want to achieve.
And we've talked in the US for sure about this problem, and I've also heard this in Europe. Do you think at an international stage people are ready to really put some of those demands down on the large technology companies?
Well, we see moves certainly in Australia around expecting companies that generate profit from being able to circulate news that's produced for the public. Every democracy needs a functional press So there should be cost sharing in providing information and knowing where that information came from between the general public and the private sector, for example. All of the data protections that have been put in place through the EU are, for me, again, the beginning of a conversation, not just notifying people of the use of their data, but the next step is saying there is no repurposing of data without the expressed authorization and, in many ways, the engagement of people so that they have an idea of the value of what they could be doing with the data that they generate. So, I see a lot of promise, and in many ways, I think the United States is a bit behind. So I hope that we're pushed to catch up.
Oh, thanks for that. I agree with you. And Amanda, I'm thinking about you too, because when you think about data, we have the data, or data science. We have the data itself. We've got the algorithms and the software that sometimes is shared, which is great. But we also have this education. And I know you're working very hard in Africa to try to increase the participation of girls and also boys in STEM education. How can we, from the other side of the world, the big companies in the West, in Europe, and in the United States, how can we help?
Okay, first things first, I think data should be boundless. And when it's boundless, it is more collaborative. Western world have more data than we do, unfortunately. Coupled up with the way technology is evolving things and all, and that's what we like behind. We need to start collaborating and working alongside with tech organizations or countries that have this data. And I also believe that we can start using data management tools that should be able to move towards like a data governance enabling approach, so that data can be trusted and accessible for all. Just like Mary said, so it's one thing for people to know that you are using their data, but another thing for people to give you that permission to use their data. So in all of this, we need to work alongside with organizations or countries that have this data.
Well, thank you very much, and I can't believe it. We only have 1 minute left. I was going to ask you all for a quick thought at the end. So what I'm going to do now is just to ask you for a quick word. Give me 1 or 2 words that for you really illustrate this problem. What you want to leave us with? Mary, you're first.
Data is all around us, but it's really our exchanges with each other. And we have to value our exchanges with each other to move forward.
Thank you. Wonderful. Zhamak.
Yeah, I just want to, I guess it's a call to action for listeners to be a bit courageous and challenge the status quo, challenge the language we developed around data. Data is not an asset to hoard. It's a product or maybe a gift to share. Data is not to collect, it's to connect. And the future is I think, decentralized. So let's work together to create those themes and common language and common standards to connect data.
Great. Great. And Amanda, you've got the last word.
Well, I think that data should not just be concentrated on a particular body or department. Democratizing data is possible if this data is transparent. So, yeah, that's my take.
Thank you so much, all of you, Mary, Zhamak, Amanda, for joining us today from all over the world. And thanks again.